Hey guys, welcome to my 7.3 Feral Guide. I'll be discussing 3 common builds you'll be utilising this patch until the new legendaries come out, and then you can probably make a new build. The first build I'll discuss is the Incons Savage Raw Blood Talons build, which is likely going to be the highest single target. There are a couple of openers you can use. I use the slow opener so that you get Tiger's Fury and full AF during the initial Incon. Once you're actually inside Incon, you want to make sure you get 3 rakes, refreshing the last one just as Incon is about to fall off. You also want to refresh Rip at least once, and also Savage Raw at least once. On your subsequent incarnations, you can skip the SR refresh if you start with the 46-second SR. You can see here I opt for a TF rake as the last GCD in Incon, and I lose out on a Ferocious Bite, which is fine. If you don't know the fight duration, you should be running Convergence of Fates to reduce your Incarnation cooldown, as Incon is a very strong cooldown compared to Berserk. Compared to 7.2.5, you are encouraged to use Ferocious Bite a lot more since it deals more damage, and also because your buffs and debuffs last a lot longer with this build. The normal rake rules apply. The pandemic is 4.5 seconds for rake, with the last tick under 3 seconds, at the 3 second mark. So if you have a 200% rake from Incon or Shadow Meld, you'll want for the rake to tick off completely before you refresh. If you have a TF rake and you're refreshing with just a vanilla one, then you'll want to refresh under 3 seconds. And if it's just a vanilla rake and you're refreshing with anything, with any other rake, you can refresh under 4.5 seconds. Finessing rake does not give as much of a gain as it did in the previous 7.2.5 build. Previously in 7.2.5 you would refresh Savage Raw around 10.5 seconds. This is actually very close to the pandemic value of Savage Raw in the current build, and with a longer Savage Raw and Rip timers, you don't have as much of a collision in refreshing both of them, and so you can actually just refresh Savage Raw during pandemic. As you can see, my second Incon has come back up. My Ashermane's Frenzy should actually already be off cooldown, however I held it for way too long on the first refresh. Incon with Cough is about 2 minutes 30, and AF is 1 minute 15, so you can use it twice per Incon cycle. Also note that I refreshed Rake, the double damage Rake, as soon as I enter Incon. If you're using the Legendary Gloves or the Thrash Braces, you'll want to make sure you get some uptime on that. With just the gloves, use it on clear casting. With braces, you can go for 100% uptime instead of using Shred outside of Incon. Similar to 7.2.5, you'll typically want to use your regrowth when you have 4 CP or 5 CP. If you're using it at 4 CP, it's likely because your next ability is going to be Rake followed by Rip. If you know that your next finisher is going to be Savage Raw, then you can opt to use the BT below 4 combo points for the Rake refresh. You can see that I'm refreshing Rip usually between 8 and 14 seconds, so I can maintain decent Ashmane's Rip uptime. You can certainly go tighter than that and go straight to Pandemic, which is 8 seconds. There isn't much in terms of pooling that is required. There are still some benefits for pooling if you're about to cast your Rip. If your Ashmane's Rip is up, then you're fairly safe to pool. This can be handy if you want to reorder some of your abilities, like if you want to cast Rake before Savage Raw, or vice versa. So if you, instead of doing Shred SR Rake, you might want to do Rake SR Shred. So that's where it comes in handy. The Ashermane's Frenzy I use here is a mistake. It should be held until Incon. Leading up to the Incon, you can see I refresh Rip before it starts, and I'm ready to cast Rake with high energy. During Incon, you'll really be tested on casting the correct abilities in the correct order with a lot less spacing than Berserk, which only lasts 15 seconds, and you have to do it consistently. On the other hand, it's very rare for you to be punished as hard as you would have been in the 7.2.5 build. Couple of things to note: if you're not playing Convergence of Fates, then you will want to use Ashwin's Frenzy once every 90 seconds, once inside Incon and once lining up with TF. The complexity of the rotation moves away from high up times, which are now fairly trivial to obtain, to how many FBs you can get into the fight. The next build I'll be discussing is a build you'll use for cleave, but I'll discuss the single target aspect of it, and then the AoE part separately. During Incarnation, you will want to use Shred twice, which is guaranteed 100% crit on both shreds to get 4 combo points, followed by a BT, BRS, and finisher. You replace the BRS with a Rake where appropriate. With this build you only have 2 finishers, being Ferocious Bite and Rip respectively. You do need to cast Ferocious Bite diligently because it gives you the sources of Blood Talons, which will enable you to buff your Brutal Slashes. Once you're outside Incon, you'll want to use your Blood Talons charges on a finisher plus BRS or Rake. Now, BRS and Ferocious Bite are approximately the same damage single target, so sometimes if you use a BT on 2 Brutal Slashes in a row, that's okay, because you wouldn't have, it's better than overcapping, and you wouldn't have been able to get an FB BRS combo. So effectively it would have been the same as doing a buffed FB and BRS plus unbuffed BRS, because they're approximately equivalent, so you can do either. You'll notice with BRS you're almost always casting, because Brutal Slash is only 20 energy. On single target, Brutal Slash and Ferocious Bite are about the same, but obviously as soon as you introduce a second target, you'll want to use your Blood Talons on BRS and have Ferocious Bite as a non-buffed ability. The way I like to think about it is that Rake is on a 15-second cooldown and Brutal Slash is on a 10-second cooldown, and so you basically want to use it before you get another. You want to pretend you refresh Rake with the Blood Talon Rake before it overcaps the charge after Pandemic. You can see from this gameplay that there's no shortage of abilities that require BT buff. Out of Brutal Slash, Rake, Rip, and FB. This differs from the Savage Roar build because when you cast Savage Roar, it doesn't consume one of the Blood Talons. So effectively, you have a finisher where one of the abilities to the side of Savage Roar is likely to be Shred. This video was made on the PTR, so I actually have quite a bit of lag, which mucks up my spell queuing. You can see from this position I want to cast Ferocious Bite followed by BRS and not Rake here because it's a double damage Rake, and then use the next finisher to refresh Rake when it's under 3 seconds. For the most part, when I have Blood Talons up, I ignore clear casting. You can see in this gameplay that I'm managing my energy before Tiger's Fury to make sure it's low, since it does burst to cap. And I use the frequent combo of FB, BRS. You can probably tell that without using Le Boots, it's quite hard to fit all your BRS into the Tiger's Fury window, and so I just ignore that completely, and I just cast BRS whenever there is a BT charge up in absence of Shred. You can see I refresh Rip anywhere between 0 and 14 seconds. To me it's largely DPS neutral because if you refresh it early, you have a chance to get a really long Ashman's Rip, but if you cast it a bit later, you also possibly get an extra FB. You can see here that my Rake is mistimed, and so I use Rake followed by BRS for my BT charges, and that's completely okay because I haven't wasted any BTs on a Shred option. For a single target, using this build, you have to stay on top of using your BRS on BT. You have to get out of the habit of using Blood Talons on Shred, and you also want to make sure that you don't overcommit to FP and let your rip drop off, which can happen at times, especially if you're trying to use a double BT BRS to fix something. This particular build is actually not too far off the Savage Raw build. Allegedly it seems 3% lower, and depending on your gear it can actually be higher. The basic summary of this same build but using Cleave is you want to keep up your dots on all your targets. You want to use Thrash instead of Shred when Thrash is in Pandemic or not up. You can feel free to use Overrip, Refresh for the Rip early instead of using Ferocious Bite, as you're really only after the BT charge for Brutal Slash. You can see here, once I get everything rolling, it's quite easy to generate enough combo points using World Shaper's Clutch to buff everything. As you can see with my rip timings on 2 targets, they're very healthy high levels. In fact, I overrip quite a bit, but you can obviously use Ferocious Bite if both the rip timers are very healthy, which I use quite a few times here. There's a bit of finessing to be had around Tiger's Fury. If you know that your next finish is going to be Ferocious Bite, then you might want to use Blood Talons and get double BRS within the TF, and then use a non-buffed just a straight Tiger's Fury FB on Cleave. That will do more damage. On the other hand, if you know that the rip is going to be your next finisher, then you want to make sure you have a Blood Talons charge for that. I've listed a general priority for 2 targets. On 3 targets, you want to buff Brutal Slash over Rake, depending on your mastery. And this is outside of Incon. Inside Incon, you'll probably still want to buff the Rake. As you can see here, it seems to do a reasonable job at getting BT on every single BRS. I've tried to keep this video short. I'm sure you can replay and look at the cost order abilities to have a feel of how the new spec plays.